The distant crack of a shotgun echoed across the dusty Wyoming plains as 8-year-old Eli Harper clutched his threadbare blanket, trembling beneath the floorboards of what had once been his home. It was 1876, and life in the West had turned as cruel as the relentless summer heat that scorched the land. 3 days had passed since outlaws had gunned down his parents over a disputed gold claim, leaving the boy alone in a world that showed little mercy to orphans. "Get in there and check for valuables," a gruff voice commanded from above. Heavy boots stomped across the wooden planks, sending dust filtering down through the cracks onto Eli's tear-streaked face. The boy had been smart enough to hide when he heard the horses approaching. Slipping into the hidden storage space his father had built to protect their meager savings during hard times. Now, that small sanctuary was all that stood between him and men who would think nothing of dispatching a child witness. "Ain't much here, Vance," another voice called out. "These folks were poor as dirt. Check the barn. Might be a horse or two we can sell in Cheyenne." Eli's heart pounded against his ribs. He knew what happened to orphans in these parts. The lucky ones ended up in overcrowded orphanages. The unlucky ones were sold as cheap labor to mines, farms, or worse places where childhood ended the moment you arrived. He'd heard his mother whisper about such things when they thought he was sleeping. As darkness fell, Eli waited until the voices and hoofbeats had long faded before crawling out from his hiding place. The house had been ransacked, anything of value taken. His mother's locket, the one memento he had desperately wanted to keep, was gone from the drawer where she'd kept it. He gathered what little food remained and a canteen of water, knowing he needed to reach the nearest town before the outlaws returned or starvation claimed him. For 2 days, he walked along the old trading trail, hiding whenever riders approached. By the time he spotted the smoke from chimneys rising above the tree line of Crystal Creek, his feet were bleeding through his worn-out boots, and hunger gnawed at his belly like a wild animal. Crystal Creek was a small but growing settlement that had sprung up around a trading post 3 years earlier. Now it boasted a general store, a saloon, and even a small church. To Eli, it might as well have been a fortress, a place where perhaps someone might help a boy with nothing to his name but the clothes on his back. He didn't make it to the main street before collapsing near the livery stable, exhaustion finally claiming its due. When he awoke, rough hands were shaking him. "Got us another stray, Vance. Young one, too, might fetch a good price." Eli's eyes flew open to see the same men who had ransacked his home. Terror seized his heart as he recognized the pockmarked face of the man called Vance, the same outlaw who had led the attack on his parents' homestead. "Please don't sell me too," begged the little boy, his voice cracking with fear and dehydration as Vance hauled him to his feet. "Ain't nobody gonna miss you, boy. You'll fetch a nice price at the mines. They always need small hands to reach the narrow places," Vance sneered, gripping Eli's arm so tightly it would surely bruise. "That's enough." The deep, steady voice cut through the air like a knife. A tall figure emerged from the shadow of the livery stable, spurs jingling softly with each deliberate step. The stranger's face was partially obscured by the brim of a well-worn Stetson, but there was no mistaking the authority in his stance or the hand that rested casually near the holstered Colt at his hip. "This ain't your business, mister," Vance spat, though Eli noticed how the outlaw's hand trembled slightly. "I'm making it my business." The stranger stepped fully into the light, revealing a man in his early 30s with sun-weathered skin and eyes that seemed to have witnessed more than their fair share of the world's cruelties. His dark blue shirt was dusty from the trail, and a silver star glinted on his vest, a deputy's badge. "Name's Zachary Everett, deputy out of Fort Laramie, And unless you want to explain to the judge why you're manhandling a child, I suggest you release him. Now." Vance's fingers dug deeper into Eli's arm for a moment before reluctantly letting go. The boy stumbled backward, expecting to hit the ground, but instead felt the steady hand of the deputy catching him. "The boy's an orphan. No kin. We're just taking him someplace where he can earn his keep," Vance argued, though his confidence was clearly faltering in the face of the law. Deputy Everett knelt beside Eli, keeping one eye on the outlaws. "That true, son? You got no family." Eli wanted to tell the truth that these were the men who had murdered his parents, but fear choked the words in his throat. What if the deputy didn't believe him? What if these men killed him too once the lawman rode away? My ma and pa are dead," was all he managed to whisper. The deputy studied Eli's face for a long moment, seeing more than the boy realized. Then he stood, positioning himself between the child and the outlaws. "I'll be taking charge of the boy," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Vance's hand twitched toward his gun, but the deputy's draw was lightning fast, his Colt appearing in his hand before Vance could clear leather. "Make a choice right now," Zachary said calmly. "Ride away, or I'll have you both in irons for attempted kidnapping, and I suspect there might be warrants with your names on them already." The standoff lasted only seconds before Vance nodded to his companion. "Come on, Mitch. Ain't worth dying over some brat." As the outlaws mounted their horses and rode out of town, the deputy holstered his weapon and turned his attention back to Eli. The boy was swaying on his feet, exhaustion and hunger taking their toll. Without a word, Zachary Everett knelt down, his weathered face softening as he reached out. The cowboy took his hand and said, "Son, you're safe now. No one's selling you anywhere." Eli's legs gave out as relief washed over him, and Deputy Everett caught him before he hit the ground. In one smooth motion, he lifted the boy into his arms. "Let's get you some food and a proper place to rest. Then you can tell me what really happened with those men." As the deputy carried him toward the town's small hotel, Eli felt the first glimmer of safety he'd known since his world had shattered. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow, but for tonight at least, he wouldn't have to face the darkness alone. The hotel was a modest two-story building with a wide porch and peeling white paint. Inside, a woman in her late 20s stood behind the front desk, her honey-brown hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her eyes widened at the sight of the deputy carrying the bedraggled child. "Zachary Everett, what in heaven's name have you brought into my establishment?" she asked, though her tone held more concern than reproach. "Trouble seems to find me, Juliet," the deputy replied with a faint smile that softened his otherwise stern features. "This young man needs a meal and a bed for the night. I'll cover the cost." Juliet Taylor came around the desk, her skirts swishing against the worn floorboards. She was tall for a woman, with intelligent eyes that quickly assessed the boy's condition. "He needs more than a meal. He needs a doctor," she said, placing a gentle hand on Eli's forehead. "He's burning up." Eli tried to protest that he was fine, but the words wouldn't come. The room had begun to spin, and the faces above him blurred. The last thing he remembered was being carried up a flight of stairs before darkness claimed him completely. When he awoke, sunlight was streaming through lace curtains, and he was lying in the softest bed he'd ever felt. For a disorienting moment, he thought he was home and that the nightmare of the past days had been just that, a nightmare. Then the door opened, and Juliet entered carrying a tray with a steaming bowl. "There you are," she said, her face brightening with relief. "We were beginning to worry you might sleep the day away entirely." Eli tried to sit up, but weakness forced him back against the pillows. "How long have I been asleep?" "Nearly a full day." Doc Miller said it was exhaustion and the beginnings of fever, but nothing his medicines couldn't fix. She set the tray on the bedside table and helped Eli into a sitting position, propping pillows behind him. "I've brought chicken broth. Best to start with something gentle on your stomach." As she handed him the spoon, Eli noticed her hands. They were strong and capable, but with an unexpected delicacy to them. Not soft like his mother's had been, but beautiful in their own way. "Thank you, madam," he said, remembering his manners despite everything. "I don't have any money to pay you, though." Juliet's smile was warm. "Deputy Everett has taken care of everything. He said to tell you he'll be back this afternoon. He's out looking for those men who were troubling you." Fear clutched at Eli's heart. "But they're dangerous. They killed my parents." The words tumbled out before he could stop them, and Juliet's expression shifted from surprise to deep compassion. She sat on the edge of the bed and took his trembling hand in hers. Zachary suspected as much. "That's why he's gone after them, not alone, mind you. He's wired the sheriff in Cheyenne for help." She squeezed his hand gently. "Now, I need you to eat this broth and get stronger. The deputy will want to hear your whole story when he returns." As Eli ate, Juliet told him about Crystal Creek to distract him from his worries. She had inherited the hotel from her uncle 3 years ago after coming west from Boston. The town was growing, she explained, with new families arriving each month to stake claims on the surrounding land. "Deputy Everett isn't actually stationed here," she continued. "He was passing through on his way back from escorting a prisoner to Fort Laramie when he found you." "Will he have to leave soon?" Eli asked, trying to hide the disappointment in his voice. Something flickered in Juliet's eyes, a question, perhaps, or a memory. "I'm not certain of his plans," she said carefully. "Zachary tends to keep his own counsel." The way she said the deputy's name suggested there was more to the story, but before Eli could ask, footsteps sounded in the hallway. A moment later, Zachary Everett entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. He looked tired but satisfied, like a man who had accomplished what he set out to do. "Miss Taylor," he greeted Juliet with a nod before turning his attention to Eli. "Good to see you awake, son. You had us worried." "Did you find them?" Eli asked, setting aside the half-empty bowl. The deputy exchanged a glance with Juliet before answering. "We did. They won't be troubling anyone else. Sheriff's men are taking them to Cheyenne to stand trial." Eli absorbed this information, relief mixing with a strange emptiness. Justice for his parents wouldn't bring them back. "I need to know what happened, Eli," Zachary said gently, pulling a chair beside the bed. "Everything you can remember about these men and what they did." As Juliet moved to leave the room to give them privacy, Eli surprised himself by asking her to stay. There was something comforting about her presence, like a flame that kept the darkness at bay. She nodded and took a seat by the window, her hands folded in her lap. Haltingly at first, then with growing steadiness, Eli recounted the events of that terrible day. How the men had come to their homestead claiming his father had jumped their mining claim. How his mother had hidden him beneath the floorboards moments before the shooting started. How he had remained hidden when the men returned to loot what little his family had possessed. Throughout his account, Deputy Everett's expression remained calm, though his eyes grew harder with each detail. When Eli finished, the room fell silent except for the ticking of a small clock on the mantel. "You've been very brave, Eli," Zachary finally said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Braver than many grown men I've known. What happens to me now?" Eli asked, the question that had been weighing on him since he'd watched his parents' bodies being lowered into hastily dug graves. "There's an orphanage in Cheyenne," the deputy began, but Juliet interrupted. "Zachary, may I speak with you outside for a moment?" The two adults stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind them. Though they spoke in hushed tones, Eli could make out fragments of their conversation. Not sending him to that place. What do you suggest, Juliet? I can't take a child on the trail. Could stay here until. Not fair to burden you. Since when have I shied away from burdens? Besides, their voices dropped too low to hear for several minutes before the door opened again. Both returned, Juliet looking determined and the deputy wearing an expression that suggested resignation mixed with something else Eli couldn't quite identify. Eli, Juliet said, sitting on the edge of his bed. How would you feel about staying here in Crystal Creek for a while? With me at the hotel, hope flared in Eli's chest, but caution tempered it. You mean, not go to the orphanage? Not unless you want to, she confirmed. It wouldn't be charity. You could help around the hotel when you're stronger, carrying bags for guests, helping in the kitchen. Would that suit you? Eli looked from Juliet to the deputy, searching for any sign of insincerity. Why would you do that for me? You don't even know me. It was Zachary who answered, his deep voice gentle. Sometimes, son, people do things not because they have to, but because it's the right thing to do. Miss Taylor has a good heart, and this town could use more young folks with courage like yours. And what about you? Eli asked, fixing his gaze on the deputy. Will you be staying too? An uncomfortable silence followed the question. Zachary cleared his throat. I have duties that take me on the trail, Eli, but Crystal Creek is on my regular circuit. I pass through every few weeks. Disappointment must have shown on Eli's face because the deputy added, and I'll need to stay in town at least until the trial. That could be a month or more, plenty of time for you to get settled in. Eli considered this. It wasn't perfect, nothing could replace what he had lost, but it was far better than being sold to the mines or sent to an orphanage. And maybe, just maybe, this place could eventually feel like home. I'd like to stay, he said finally, if Miss Taylor really doesn't mind. Juliet's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Then it settled. And please call me Juliet. Miss Taylor makes me feel like a schoolmarm. For the first time since his parents died, Eli felt something like hope unfurling in his chest. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was there a tiny flame that might, with care, grow stronger. What none of them realized then was how their lives would become intertwined in the coming months, or how the tragedy that had brought them together would eventually forge bonds stronger than any of them could have imagined. As days turned into weeks, Eli settled into life at the Crystal Creek Hotel. Juliet had converted a small storage room off the kitchen into a bedroom for him, furnished with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small desk where he could practice his letters. She insisted he continue his education, setting aside an hour each evening to work through the McGuffey reader she had ordered from Denver. For his part, Eli threw himself into his new responsibilities with determination that sometimes surprised even himself. He swept the porch each morning, carried water to the rooms, and helped Mrs. Fenwick, the cook, by peeling potatoes and chopping vegetables. The work was honest and straightforward, giving his mind less time to dwell on the memories that still haunted his dreams. Deputy Everett took rooms at the hotel while he prepared for the trial, spending his days interviewing witnesses and building the case against Vance and his accomplice. In the evenings, he often joined Eli and Juliet for supper, bringing tales of his travels across the territory that captivated the boys' imagination. Have you ever fought Indians? Eli asked one evening as they sat around the kitchen table, the remains of apple pie before them. Eli. Juliet admonished. That's not an appropriate question, but Zachary merely smiled, cutting another slice of pie. It's all right. And no, Eli, I haven't fought them. Traded with them, learned from them, even shared meals with some. The newspapers make it sound like there's war everywhere, but most tribes just want to be left in peace to live their lives, same as anyone. My pa said something similar, Eli said quietly. He always traded fair with the Shoshone who passed through our land. A comfortable silence fell, broken only by the clink of forks against plates and the occasional pop from the stove where a pot of coffee was keeping warm. "Will you tell us about Boston, Juliet?" Zachary asked, clearly seeking to shift the conversation to lighter ground. Eli might like to hear about the big city. She laughed, a sound that had become more frequent in recent weeks. Boston would seem like another world to someone raised in Wyoming. Streets paved with cobblestones instead of dirt, buildings so tall they block out the sun, and so many people that sometimes you can't move for the crush. "Do you miss it?" Eli asked, noticing how her eyes took on a faraway look. "Sometimes," she admitted. "I miss the libraries and theaters, the lectures at the university. But then I step outside on a clear morning and see the mountains against the sky, and I know I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." Her gaze met Zachary's across the table, holding for a moment longer than was necessary before she looked away, a faint color rising in her cheeks. These moments, the shared meals, the quiet conversations, became the framework around which Eli built his new life. He began to notice things. How Zachary always arrived early for dinner to help set the table. How Juliet's laughter came more easily when the deputy was present. How they both seemed to find reasons to be in the same room, even when no words passed between them. One afternoon in late September, Eli was splitting kindling behind the hotel when he overheard a conversation that wasn't meant for his ears. Juliet and Zachary were standing near the rain barrel, their voices low but carrying in the still autumn air. "The trial date is set," the deputy was saying. "First week of October in Cheyenne. Judge Parker is presiding." "That's good news," Juliet replied. "Will Eli need to testify?" "I've managed to convince the prosecutor it isn't necessary. The boy's been through enough." A pause followed, filled with unspoken words, and after the trial, Juliet finally asked, her voice carefully neutral, "Will you be heading back to Fort Laramie?" Eli held his breath, the axe motionless in his hands as he waited for the answer. "I've been thinking about that," Zachary said slowly. "Sheriff Wilson mentioned Crystal Creek might be needing a lawman of its own soon. Town's growing. Too much for him to oversee from Cheyenne. Are you saying you might stay?" The hope in Juliet's voice was unmistakable. "I'm saying I'm considering it, if I had sufficient reason." Another pause, longer this time. "What would constitute sufficient reason, Deputy Everett?" Juliet's tone had changed, taking on a quality Eli hadn't heard before, something both challenging and vulnerable. "That depends on whether certain people in town might welcome my more permanent presence." "I can think of at least 2 people who would welcome it very much." The sound of approaching footsteps sent Eli back to his work, splitting wood with newfound enthusiasm as he processed what he'd overheard. The idea of Zachary staying in Crystal Creek permanently filled him with a joy he hadn't expected. It had been so long since he'd allowed himself to hope for anything beyond immediate survival that the feeling was almost foreign. That evening, a telegram arrived from Cheyenne. Vance had escaped custody during transfer to the courthouse, killing a deputy in the process. Zachary read the message twice before crumpling it in his fist, his expression darkening. "I have to go," he told Juliet, already reaching for his hat and gun belt. "Wilson needs every available man for the manhunt." "Of course," she said, though her face had gone pale. "When will you return?" "As soon as we catch him." He paused at the door, looking back at Juliet and Eli. "Keep the doors locked after dark." Vance is desperate, and he knows Eli can identify him. After he left, Juliet moved through the hotel with brisk efficiency, checking windows and instructing the few guests to remain indoors for the evening. But when all was secure and Eli was preparing for bed, he found her sitting alone in the kitchen, a cup of untouched tea before her, staring into nothing. "He'll be all right," Eli said, surprising himself with his certainty. "Deputy Everett is the smartest, bravest man I know." Juliet smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "When did you get so wise, Eli Harper? My ma used to say I was born with an old soul." He hesitated, then asked the question that had been on his mind. "Do you love him?" The directness of the question startled a laugh from her. "My goodness, you certainly don't mince words. Ma also said life's too short for beating around the bush. Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman." Juliet sighed, considering the question seriously. "I'm not sure what I feel, Eli. Zachary Everett is a complicated man. He keeps much of himself hidden away. But you care about him." "Yes," she admitted softly. "More than I probably should, given how uncertain his future here is." Eli took her hand, his small fingers wrapping around hers with surprising strength. "He's coming back, and not just because of Vance. He's coming back for us." For 3 agonizing days they waited for news. Juliet kept the hotel running with outward calm, but Eli noticed how she startled at every sound, how her eyes constantly drifted toward the road leading into town. On the 4th morning, as Eli was sweeping the front porch, he spotted a cloud of dust in the distance that gradually resolved into a group of riders. "Juliet," he called, dropping the broom and running inside. "Riders coming." She emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, trying and failing to hide her anxiety. Together they watched as the group drew closer. Eli counted 5 men, and his heart sank when he didn't immediately recognize Zachary among them. "Stay inside," Juliet instructed, her voice tight, "until we know who they are." But as the riders approached the hotel, Eli spotted the familiar broad-shouldered figure at the rear of the group. Relief washed over him so intensely that his knees nearly buckled. "It's him. Deputy Everett is with them." Juliet's composure cracked then, a small sob escaping her as she pressed a hand to her mouth. Before she could recover, Eli was racing down the steps and across the dusty street, ignoring her calls to come back. The riders reined in their horses as the boy approached. Sheriff Wilson, whom Eli recognized from his one visit to town, raised an eyebrow at the child running toward them. "Looks like you've got a welcoming committee, Everett," he commented as Zachary dismounted. The deputy knelt as Eli reached him, checking the boy for signs of distress. "Everything all right at the hotel, Eli? Miss Taylor?" "We're fine," Eli assured him, breathless from his run. "Did you catch him, Vance?" A shadow crossed Zachary's face. "We did. He won't be troubling anyone ever again." Something in his tone told Eli that Vance hadn't been taken alive, but before he could ask for details, he noticed the crude bandage wrapped around the deputy's left arm, blood seeping through the fabric. "You're hurt." "It's nothing. Bullet just grazed me." But Zachary winced as he stood, suggesting the wound was more serious than he claimed. By then, Juliet had reached them, her earlier emotion hidden behind a mask of proper concern. "Deputy, you should come inside and let me tend to that arm." "Sheriff Wilson, gentlemen, you're all welcome to rest and refresh yourselves at the hotel." As the men dismounted and led their horses to the hitching posts, Zachary fell into step beside Juliet. Eli, walking slightly ahead, heard her whisper, "I thought you might not come back." "I promised I would," Zachary replied simply. In the kitchen, Juliet insisted on treating the deputy's wound herself, sending Eli to fetch hot water and clean bandages. The bullet had done more than graze his arm. It had carved a deep furrow along his bicep that would leave yet another scar among the many that already marked his body. "This needs stitches," Juliet said, her hand steady despite the concern in her voice. Doc Miller can see to it later. For now, just wrap it tight enough to stop the bleeding. As she worked, Zachary recounted the pursuit in low tones, mindful of Eli's presence. They had tracked Vance to an abandoned mining camp in the foothills. When cornered, he had chosen to fight rather than surrender, wounding 2 deputies before being shot. His partner confessed everything, Zachary concluded. About Eli's parents, about their plan to sell orphan children to the mining operations. They've been doing it for years. And now it's over, Juliet said softly, securing the fresh bandage with a neat knot. Not quite. Zachary's expression grew serious. There's still the matter of Eli's future to settle. The boy, who had been sitting quietly nearby, looked up sharply. What do you mean? I thought I was staying here. That was a temporary arrangement, son. With Vance gone, we need to consider more permanent options. Fear clutched at Eli's heart. You're sending me to the orphanage after all. No, Juliet interjected firmly. Absolutely not. Zachary raised an eyebrow at her vehemence. What do you suggest, then? A boy needs more than a hotel room and odd jobs. He needs a proper home, schooling, a family. I have a proposition, Juliet said, her chin lifting with determination. But I'd prefer to discuss it with you privately, Deputy. Eli wanted to protest, but something in Juliet's expression stopped him. Instead, he reluctantly left the kitchen when she asked, though he only went as far as the hallway, where he could still hear their voices if he pressed his ear to the door. I want to adopt him, Juliet stated without preamble. Adopt him? Zachary sounded surprised. Juliet, do you understand what you're proposing? An unmarried woman taking in a boy that age people will talk. Let them talk. I care more about what happens to Eli than about wagging tongues. It's not just about gossip, it's about what's best for the boy. He needs stability, guidance, a father figure. Are you saying I'm incapable of providing a good home? There was a dangerous edge to Juliet's voice now. That's not what I meant. Zachary's tone softened. You're one of the most capable women I've ever met. But raising a boy alone, especially one who's experienced such trauma, it's a heavy burden. I'm stronger than I look, Deputy. A long silence followed, broken only by the sound of a chair scraping across the floor. I know you are, Zachary finally said, but you shouldn't have to carry this alone. What alternative would you suggest? Another pause, so lengthy that Eli nearly pushed open the door to see what was happening. Marry me, Zachary said, his voice so low Eli almost missed it. I beg your pardon, Juliet's response was barely above a whisper. Marry me, he repeated, more firmly this time. We could adopt Eli together, give him a real home, a family. Zachary Everett, if this is some misguided attempt at chivalry, it's not chivalry, Juliet. He broke off, seeming to struggle for words. It's something I've been considering since long before Eli came into our lives. I just never found the right moment, or perhaps the right courage to speak of it. You're proposing marriage as a practical solution to a problem. Her voice had cooled considerably. No, damn it, Zachary said with sudden intensity. I'm proposing marriage because I love you. Because I've loved you since that first day I rode into Crystal Creek and saw you standing on the hotel porch with flour on your cheek and fire in your eyes. Because I want to build a life with you, a home, a family. Eli needs us both, yes, but that's not why I'm asking. I'm asking because the thought of riding away from you again is more than I can bear. The kitchen fell silent. Eli held his breath, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain they must hear it through the door. If I were to say yes, Juliet finally said, her voice trembling slightly, would you give up the trail? Could you be content with the life of a small-town lawman? I've seen enough of the wild places to last several lifetimes. What I haven't had nearly enough of is waking up in the same bed each morning, or coming home to the same hearth each night, or seeing your face across the table from mine. A pause, then. I'm tired of chasing Juliet. I'm ready to be caught. Yes. The word was simple, definitive. Yes. Zachary sounded almost disbelieving. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, we'll adopt Eli together. Yes to building a home and a family and whatever future comes our way. Eli couldn't contain himself any longer. He burst through the door to find Juliet and Zachary standing close together, her hands clasped in his, both turning with startled expressions that quickly softened when they saw him. "I'm getting a family," he asked, hope making his voice crack. Zachary and Juliet exchanged a look filled with so much warmth that Eli felt it like sunshine on his face. "If that's what you want," Juliet said gently, "more than anything." Eli hesitated, then added, "But only if I can still help at the hotel. Mrs. Fenwick says I'm the best potato peeler she's ever had." Zachary laughed, a full, rich sound that seemed to fill the kitchen. "I believe that can be arranged." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Sheriff Wilson offered Zachary the position of town marshal, which he accepted without hesitation. The town council, pleased to have secured such an experienced lawman, provided a small house near the edge of town as part of his compensation, a sturdy 2-bedroom structure with a front porch and room for a garden. Juliet insisted on a proper wedding, though not an elaborate one. "Simple but dignified," she told Mrs. Fenwick as they planned the refreshments. "And Eli must have a new suit for the occasion." For his part, Eli threw himself into helping prepare their new home, painting fences under Zachary's supervision and helping Juliet decide where furniture should be placed. His nightmares grew less frequent, though they didn't disappear entirely. On the nights when he woke crying out, he found comfort in knowing that down the hall, 2 people who cared deeply for him were ready to offer solace. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning, with golden aspen leaves drifting lazily from the trees surrounding the small church. Eli stood proudly at Zachary's side, holding the ring on a small velvet cushion as Juliet walked down the aisle in a dress of deep blue silk, her one concession to Boston finery. "Do you, Zachary James Everett, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Thompson asked. "I do," Zachary answered, his voice steady and sure. "And do you, Juliet Ann Taylor, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," she replied, her eyes never leaving Zachary's face. As they exchanged rings, Eli felt a curious mixture of joy and sadness wash over him. Joy for the new family being formed before his eyes, and sadness for the parents who would never see him grow to manhood. The emotions must have shown on his face, because after the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and after Zachary had kissed his bride to the applause of the gathered townspeople, both of them turned to Eli. "There's one more thing we'd like to do today," Juliet said, taking Eli's hand. Zachary produced a document from his pocket and handed it to Reverend Thompson, who nodded in understanding. Zachary and Juliet Everett wished to legally adopt Eli Harper as their son, the Reverend announced to the congregation. "They ask for your witness and blessing as they make this commitment." Tears blurred Eli's vision as Zachary knelt before him, placing his hands on the boy's shoulders. "Eli, I can't replace the father you lost. I wouldn't try to, but I promise to guide you, protect you, and love you as my own for all the days of my life. Will you accept me as your father?" Eli could only nod, his throat too tight for words. Juliet knelt beside her new husband, taking Eli's hands in hers. "And I promise to cherish you, nurture you, and stand by you through whatever life brings. Will you accept me as your mother?" "Yes," Eli managed to whisper. "Both of you." As the 3 of them embraced, surrounded by the community that had become their extended family. Eli felt something settle within him, a sense of belonging that he had feared might never return after the tragedy that had taken his birth parents. The following spring brought new beginnings to Crystal Creek. The town had grown through the winter months, with a school being established in what had once been the back room of the general store. Eli, now officially Eli Harper Everett, was enrolled alongside 15 other children from the surrounding area. Zachary took to his role as town marshal with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, establishing regular patrols and ensuring that the occasional rowdy cowboys who passed through understood that Crystal Creek was a place of law and order. Most evenings found him on the front porch of their home, pipe in hand, watching the sunset with the contentment of a man who had found his place in the world. Juliet continued to manage the hotel, though she had hired additional staff to allow her more time at home. Her business acumen had never been in question, but now her happiness seemed to lend an extra vibrancy to everything she touched. The Crystal Creek Hotel became known throughout the territory as a haven of comfort and excellent cooking. For Eli, the transition from orphaned victim to beloved son had not been without challenges. There were still nights when he woke trembling from dreams of gunfire and hiding spaces. There were days when a chance resemblance or a particular sound would transport him back to the worst moments of his young life. But always, Zachary and Juliet were there, patient and understanding, helping him navigate the complex emotions of grief and recovery. On a warm afternoon in late May, as Eli was returning from school, he noticed a wagon stopped outside their home. A woman sat on the driver's seat, holding the reins of two tired-looking horses. Beside her was a small figure that Eli at first took to be a child. As he approached, the woman turned toward him young, perhaps 20, with dark circles under her eyes and clothes that had seen better days. The figure beside her was indeed a child, a boy no more than 5 or 6, with the same haunted look that Eli recognized from his own reflection in those first terrible days after losing his parents. "Excuse me," the woman called as Eli drew near. "Is this where Marshal Everett lives?" "Yes, madam," Eli replied politely. "He's my father. He's probably at the jail right now, but I can fetch him for you if it's urgent." The woman hesitated, looking down at the boy beside her. "It might be best if I speak with him directly. My name is Sarah Donovan. This is my brother Thomas." "Our parents." She trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. "Are they dead?" Eli asked with the directness of a child who had faced the worst and survived. She nodded, tears filling her eyes. "2 weeks ago, Indians raided our homestead near the Big Horn. Thomas and I were gathering berries in the woods. We came back to find." Again, she couldn't finish. "You should come inside," Eli said decisively. "My mother is home. She'll know what to do while I fetch Pa." He led them to the house, calling out as they entered, "Ma, there are people who need help." Juliet emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern as she took in the bedraggled pair. With the instinctive hospitality that had become second nature, she ushered them to the table, set out bread and milk, and gently coaxed their story from Sarah while Eli ran to find Zachary. By the time father and son returned, Juliet had learned that Sarah and Thomas had traveled over 100 miles, fleeing the scene of the attack with little more than the clothes on their backs and what few supplies they could gather. They had heard of Crystal Creek as a growing settlement where they might find work and safety. "Miss Donovan," Zachary said after hearing their story, "you've shown remarkable courage getting your brother to safety. You're welcome to stay in Crystal Creek as long as you wish." "Thank you, Marshal," Sarah replied, her exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "But I'm not sure how we'll manage. I have so little money and Thomas is too young to work." "Juliet can always use help at the hotel," Zachary suggested, looking to his wife for confirmation. "Absolutely," Juliet agreed without hesitation. "We have a small room available for staff. It would accommodate both of you comfortably." "And Thomas can come to school with me," Eli added eagerly. "The teacher, Miss Hollister, is real nice. She doesn't even mind if you don't know all your letters yet." Thomas, who had not spoken a word since their arrival, looked up at Eli with the first flicker of interest he had shown. Something passed between the two boys, a recognition, perhaps, of shared experience that created an immediate bond. As arrangements were made for Sarah and Thomas to settle temporarily at the hotel, with promises of more permanent housing once they were established, Eli found himself thinking about how quickly life could change for better or worse. One moment, you could be a child with parents who loved you, and the next, an orphan facing an uncertain future. But sometimes, if you were very lucky, that uncertainty led to unexpected blessings. That evening, after Sarah and Thomas had been settled at the hotel and the family had returned home, Eli found Zachary on the porch, staring thoughtfully into the gathering dusk. "Pa," Eli said, joining him on the bench. "What's on your mind, son?" Zachary asked, draping an arm around the boy's shoulders. "I was thinking about Thomas, about how scared he must be. I imagine he is. Fear's a natural response to what he's been through." Eli nodded, considering this. "When you found me, I was scared too. Scared of being sold, scared of being alone." "I remember," Zachary said softly, "but you and Ma made everything better. Not right away sometimes, I'm still scared, but better." Eli paused, gathering his thoughts. "Do you think we could make things better for Thomas and Miss Sarah too?" Zachary studied his son's face in the fading light, pride evident in his expression. "I believe we already have, by offering them safe harbor. What did you have in mind beyond that? Maybe they could come for Sunday dinner sometimes, and I could show Thomas my fishing spot by the creek. And maybe—" Eli hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Maybe if they don't find another place to live, they could have the room you're using as an office. You always say you do your best thinking on the porch anyway." A slow smile spread across Zachary's face. "Those sound like fine ideas, Eli. We'll discuss them with your mother." He tousled the boy's hair affectionately. "You've got a big heart, son. Don't ever lose that." The screen door opened behind them, and Juliet joined them on the porch, settling beside Zachary. "What are my two favorite men discussing so seriously?" "The future," Zachary replied, slipping his arm around her waist, "and how sometimes it arrives in unexpected ways." Juliet leaned her head against his shoulder, reaching across to take Eli's hand. "The best things often do." As twilight deepened into night, the three of them sat together, bound not by blood but by choice and circumstance and love. From the ashes of tragedy, they had forged something precious and enduring, a family built on compassion, understanding, and the simple truth that had been spoken on that fateful day when a desperate boy and a determined lawman first crossed paths. "Please don't sell me too," the little boy had begged, and the cowboy had taken his hand and said, "Son, you're safe now." In the end, it was a promise kept not just for a day or a season, but for a lifetime. Winter came early to Crystal Creek that year, with the first snow falling before the harvest was fully complete. By December, drifts piled high against the fences, and the main street became a corridor of white broken only by the tracks of horses and wagons. Inside the Everett home, warmth and laughter defied the cold. Sarah and Thomas Donovan had indeed become frequent visitors, with Thomas and Eli forming a friendship that reminded the adults of brothers more than mere acquaintances. Sarah had proven herself indispensable at the hotel, her quiet efficiency and attention to detail impressing even Juliet's exacting standards. Though they had found suitable lodging in town, they spent most Sundays with the Everetts, creating a weekly tradition that expanded the definition of family for all involved. On Christmas Eve, as a fire crackled in the hearth and pine boughs decorated with ribbon and dried berries adorned the mantel, Zachary cleared his throat to gain everyone's attention. "I have an announcement," he said, his arm around Juliet's shoulders. "One that affects all of us." Eli looked up from the checkers game he was playing with Thomas, curiosity piqued by the unusual formality in his father's tone. "Juliet and I are expecting a child," Zachary continued, his face breaking into a smile that seemed to illuminate the room. "Come summer, there will be a new addition to our family." The news was met with exclamations of joy and congratulations. Sarah hugged Juliet, while Thomas looked slightly confused by the adult's excitement. Eli sat very still, absorbing the information with an expression that Zachary couldn't quite read. Later, after Sarah and Thomas had departed and the house had grown quiet, Zachary found Eli sitting alone on his bed, staring out the window at the star-filled sky. "You've been awful quiet since our announcement," Zachary said, sitting beside him. "Anything you'd like to talk about?" Eli shrugged, not meeting his father's eyes. "It's nothing." "Eli," Zachary's voice was gentle but firm. "In this family, we don't dismiss each other's feelings as nothing. If something's troubling you, I'd like to know what it is." For a long moment, Eli remained silent. Then, in a rush, the words tumbled out. "Will you and Ma still want me when the baby comes? A real baby of your own?" Understanding dawned in Zachary's eyes. He turned Eli to face him, his hands on the boy's shoulders. "Eli Harper Everett, listen to me very carefully. You are our son. Not by birth, perhaps, but by choice, which in many ways is stronger. The baby coming doesn't change that. It doesn't diminish our love for you by one iota." "But no buts," Zachary insisted. "When Juliet and I married, when we adopted you, we made vows every bit as binding as the ones we made to each other. Family isn't about who shares your blood. It's about who shares your heart." Tears welled in Eli's eyes. "I just don't want things to change." "Some things will change," Zachary acknowledged. "That's the nature of life, but our love for you, that's constant as the North Star." From the doorway came Juliet's voice, soft with emotion. "Your father's right, Eli. This baby won't be replacing you. It will be joining you as your brother or sister, and we'll need your help to teach this little one all the important things about being part of our family." Eli looked from one parent to the other, seeing nothing but sincerity in their faces. Slowly, the knot of anxiety in his chest began to loosen. "I could teach the baby to fish," he offered tentatively, "and how to spot deer tracks." "Absolutely," Zachary agreed, relief evident in his smile. "Who better?" Juliet crossed the room to sit on Eli's other side, completing the circle. "I've been thinking," she said, "that we might need a bigger house with the baby coming. Perhaps we could build one with a room for you that has its own window seat for reading." Eli's eyes widened. "Really? Could I help design it? We'd insist on it," Zachary assured him. "After all, you know better than anyone what a boy needs in a proper bedroom." As they continued to discuss possibilities for their future home, the last of Eli's fears melted away, replaced by a growing excitement. Change was coming, yes, but perhaps not all change was to be feared. Perhaps some changes, like the ones that had brought him to this family in the first place, were the kind that opened doors to new adventures and deeper joys. Spring arrived with its usual riot of wildflowers and the music of snowmelt rushing in the creeks. Juliet's condition became increasingly evident, her dresses adapted to accommodate her growing midsection. Far from slowing her down, however, pregnancy seemed to energize her. She oversaw the construction of their new home with meticulous attention to detail, insisting on large windows to capture the mountain views and a wraparound porch where the family could gather on summer evenings. Eli, true to his word, had thrown himself into the role of big brother in waiting with enthusiasm. He helped prepare the nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow and assisting Zachary in building a cradle that was a masterpiece of craftsmanship. At school, he proudly informed his classmates of the impending arrival, accepting their congratulations with the air of someone who had personally arranged the blessed event. On a warm June evening, just as twilight was settling over the mountains, Juliet's labor began. Sarah arrived to stay with Eli while Zachary escorted his wife to Doc Miller's house, where the physician had established a small infirmary for such occasions. "Everything will be fine," Sarah assured Eli as they watched Zachary help Juliet into the wagon. "Your mother is strong and healthy." Eli nodded, but worry creased his young brow. He had overheard enough adult conversations to know that childbirth could be dangerous, even for the strongest women. "How long will it take?" he asked. "Babies come in their own time," Sarah replied. "Could be hours, could be longer." "Why don't we play some cards to pass the time?" They sat at the kitchen table, playing hand after hand of gin rummy as the clock ticked steadily on the mantel. Despite Sarah's efforts to distract him, Eli's attention constantly drifted to the window, watching for any sign of his father's return. It was nearly dawn when they heard the sound of horses outside. Eli was at the door before Sarah could stop him, flinging it open to find Zachary climbing down from the wagon, his face etched with fatigue but radiant with joy. "You have a sister," he announced, catching Eli in a bear hug. 7 pounds, with a set of lungs that would put a cavalry bugler to shame. "And Ma?" Eli asked, his voice muffled against his father's chest. "Tired but well. She's asking for you. Get your coat, Doc says we can visit for a few minutes before coming home to rest." The ride to town passed in a blur of anticipation. At the infirmary, Zachary led Eli to a small, clean room where Juliet lay in bed, her face pale but glowing with an inner light. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in white. "Come meet your sister, Eli," she said softly. With a reverence he had never before displayed, Eli approached the bed. Juliet shifted the bundle so he could see the infant's face red and wrinkled, with a tuft of dark hair peeking from beneath the blanket. "She's so small," he whispered. "But perfect in every way," Juliet assured him. "Would you like to hold her?" Eli's eyes widened in alarm. "What if I drop her?" "You won't," Zachary said confidently, guiding Eli to sit in the chair beside the bed. "Just support her head like this." With infinite care, Juliet transferred the baby to Eli's arms. The moment the warm weight settled against him, something extraordinary happened in Eli's heart, a flowering of protective love so intense it almost hurt. "What's her name?" he asked, not taking his eyes from his sister's face. "We thought you might help us decide," Juliet said. "We've narrowed it down to Elizabeth or Katherine." Eli studied the baby thoughtfully. "She looks like a Katherine to me. We could call her Kate for short." "Katherine it is," Zachary agreed, placing one hand on Eli's shoulder and the other on Juliet's. "Katherine Hope Everett." "Hope." Eli looked up, questioning. "Because she represents all our hopes for the future," Juliet explained. "Just as you do, Eli." In that moment, surrounded by the family that fate and choice had given him, Eli felt a sense of completion that had eluded him since the day he lost his birth parents. The circle had been broken, then reformed, stronger for having been tested by fire. Katherine Hope Everett, as if sensing the significance of the moment, opened her eyes dark blue, unfocused, yet somehow managing to find Eli's face. Her tiny hand escaped the blanket, fingers spreading like a starfish before closing around Eli's offered finger with surprising strength. "Look at that," Zachary said softly. "She knows her big brother already." "I'll always protect you, Kate," Eli promised, the words emerging unbidden but with absolute conviction. No matter what. It was a vow he would keep through all the years that followed, through childhood scrapes and teenage rebellions, through joys and sorrows yet unimagined. The bond formed in that quiet room would weather every storm life sent their way, anchored in the love of the family that had begun when a desperate orphan pleaded for mercy, and found instead a future filled with hope. As summer gave way to fall, and fall to another Wyoming winter, the Everett household settled into new rhythms dictated by Katherine's needs and milestones. The baby thrived under the adoring attention of her family, growing from a helpless infant into a curious, active child who delighted in pulling herself up on furniture and exploring every corner of the house. For his 10th birthday in March, Eli received a pony of his own, a gentle sorrel mare named Penny that Zachary had trained specifically with his son in mind. The gift represented more than just an animal. It was a recognition of Eli's increasing maturity and responsibility. With Penny, Eli's world expanded beyond the boundaries of Crystal Creek, allowing him to explore the surrounding countryside and occasionally accompany Zachary on his shorter patrols. Crystal Creek itself continued to grow and prosper. A proper schoolhouse was built that spring, with Miss Hollister installed as the permanent teacher. The jail, once a single cell attached to the marshal's office, was expanded to accommodate the occasional influx of troublemakers who passed through town. A bank opened its doors, and talk began of bringing the railroad through within the next few years. Through it all, the bond between Zachary and Juliet deepened, their partnership strengthened by the challenges and joys of parenthood and community leadership. They were no longer simply the marshal and the hotel proprietress. They had become the heart of Crystal Creek, their home a gathering place for friends and travelers alike. On the anniversary of their wedding, a full 3 years after they had first exchanged vows, Zachary surprised Juliet with a gift that left her speechless, a gold locket almost identical to the one Eli had described losing when his parents were killed. "How did you find it?" she gasped, opening the locket to find a miniature photograph of Eli on one side and Katherine on the other. "I didn't find the original," Zachary admitted, "but I remembered Eli's description, had it made special by a jeweler in Denver." Juliet's eyes filled with tears as she fastened the locket around her neck. "It's perfect. Thank you." Later, after the children were asleep, they sat together on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. "Did I ever tell you," Zachary said quietly, "about the day I decided to stay in Crystal Creek?" "I assumed it was when you proposed," Juliet replied, nestled against his side. "No, it was earlier." He gazed out at the silhouette of mountains against the night sky. "It was the day I found Eli. When I saw those men trying to take him, something shifted inside me. I'd spent years chasing outlaws across the territory, seeing the worst of what people can do to each other. But in that moment, watching a child being treated like property to be sold, I realized I wanted to build something instead of just preventing destruction." Juliet took his hand, intertwining their fingers. "And have you built something, I mean, more than I ever dreamed possible?" He turned to face her, his expression earnest in the moonlight. "When I took Eli's hand that day and called him son, I had no idea what I was really beginning. I just knew I couldn't let another child suffer if I had the power to prevent it. One choice," Juliet mused. "One moment of courage and compassion that changed so many lives, including, most of all, my own." Zachary drew her closer. I rode into Crystal Creek a solitary man with nowhere to call home. Now look at what I have: a wife, children, a community that matters to me. A purpose beyond the next manhunt or the next trail. Do you ever miss it? The freedom of the trail. It was a question Juliet had never asked before, though it had sometimes lingered in her mind during the early days of their marriage. Not for a moment, Zachary assured her without hesitation. Freedom isn't about the absence of ties, Juliet. It's about choosing the right ones. As if to punctuate his words, a cry came from inside the house, Katherine awakening for her midnight feeding. Juliet rose, pausing to kiss Zachary before going inside. "I'll bring her out when she's settled," she promised. "It's too beautiful a night to waste indoors." Alone on the porch, Zachary leaned back in the swing, contemplating the path that had led him to this moment. He thought of Eli, asleep upstairs, growing taller and more confident with each passing day. Of Katherine, her personality emerging with its own distinct spark. Of the town spreading out around them, built on the collective dreams and efforts of people seeking their own versions of home. And of Juliet, the unexpected center of it all. The woman who had taught him that courage came in many forms, not all of them involving guns or badges. The courage to open one's heart, to embrace joy after knowing sorrow, to build a life despite the uncertainties that always lurked at the edges of the wilderness. The door opened, and Juliet returned with Katherine in her arms, the baby now content and drowsy after her feeding. Without a word, Zachary made room for them on the swing, creating a tableau that would have seemed impossible to him just a few years before. A family, his family, gathered in the quiet of a mountain evening. "What are you thinking about?" Juliet asked, noting his contemplative expression. "The future," he replied simply, "and how bright it looks from here." As the swing moved gently back and forth, a shooting star blazed across the heavens, brief, brilliant, and beautiful. Like a life, Zachary thought. Like all our lives, moving through time and space, creating light where once there was darkness. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound floating across the valley like a prayer or a promise. Zachary Everett, once a solitary rider with nothing to lose and little to gain, tightened his arm around his family and gave silent thanks for the twist of fate that had placed a frightened boy in his path and changed the course of all their lives. "Please don't sell me too," the boy had begged. And in answering that plea, Zachary had found not just a son, but a home, a wife, a daughter, a purpose, a life worth far more than all the gold in Wyoming. A life built on love, sustained by hope, and enriched by the daily miracles of family. It was, he reflected as sleep finally claimed them all, the greatest treasure a man could ask for, and one he would cherish until his dying day.